egress off the island in times of emergency. So this island has a lot of risks, but there are opportunities for these risks to be turned into opportunities for communal advancement. And some of these changes can be inspired from the vernacular precedents of the Philippines, one being the Bahay Kubo, which is traditional stilt housing in the Philippines. And it has very simple spatial planning that allows for both passive ventilation and solar control strategies, as well as separating the kind of sleeping spaces away from the ground and providing a key moment of connection of the living spaces back to the ground plane. And this spatial planning can also be found in some local precedents in the Baseco compound, primarily the base community, which is a government housing program that took place a couple years ago to replace housing that was lost during a fire for 229 families. And these provided 450 square foot units, about 229 of them, and with this very simple spatial planning, very reminiscent of the Bajo Kubo, where instead of having the living spaces and the sleeping spaces on the same level, they simply stack them to create a townhouse configuration, as well as providing some vertical chases throughout the townhouses to provide passive ventilation. Now the question is, with these houses, they're still kind of exposed to the flooding conditions and right on the ground, so there's room to improve on this design. And there are also additional opportunities within the site itself, in the inlet between the bay and the beach. So we have the Baseco Park, which is pretty much the only hardscape plaza for community activities on the entire island. You have the beach, a mangrove nursery that I described that has been able to reestablish some of the native mangrove species, but it's pretty much under the care of the residents after administration changes. And there are also some retail and services that provide vendor opportunities and an opportunity for local material recycling. So in the renewal of the Baseco compound in this specific site, this will be a testbed for 3 distinct modules for resilient housing and community centers. 2 of them, the Bahay Kublihan and the Bahay Patayo, will provide elevated housing, while the Kapwa Community Center will provide a new focal point for the community, building off of the pre-existing axes and strengthening them with an urban siding. And this will work in conjunction with the environmental restoration of the island by restoring the native mangrove forests and building off of the great work already being done by the community members, by reestablishing these specific species that are already on site and converting them into more of a green zone that prevents the impacts of seasonal and storm flooding, while also providing a connection to the natural environment for the residents. And there will also be key points within the actual mangrove that you will have opportunities to go beyond, whether or not you need to access amenities like the beach or to access economic activities like fishing and other sea-based activities. So as the built environment expands and grows, so too will the natural environment with the restoration of both the mangroves and the resilient housing. And this idea of the restoration of natural environments will integrate into the actual experience of the urban scapes, with rainwater gardens on the primary boulevard access to the site and plantings and community gardens integrated between the residential units. And on the ground level, these will take cues from the elevation of the previous housing to elevate the primary occupied spaces above the flood level and providing the primary access to the ground and connecting to the ground and allowing these ground levels to act as an open space that can weather floods and any other water events that happen on the site, so that the space on the ground becomes a more of a flexible and almost a sacrificial layer, but this sacrifice leads into the continued renewal and can be used after the floodwaters recede. So with the spaces within the urban design itself, the new urban scape will provide boundaries for the plazas and the passageways and the boulevards that emphasize these axes on the site, as well as protecting the existing primary thoroughfare for emergency circulation. So this plaza, rather than being an open, undefined scape on the kind of the edge of the site, it will be now a kind of primary space for communal gatherings. And on the ground, this sacrificial layer will also serve as an opportunity for the new community members to participate in economic activities. So each of these ground levels will feature flexible vendor spaces operated by operable bamboo partitions that can raise and lower, that you can see in this perspective here. And these are the vendor spaces underneath the Bahayo Patayo module. So this module consists of 8 residential units in a townhouse configuration, and it features opportunities for cross ventilation alongside the other module, which is the Bahayo Kublihan, which will act as a threshold between the plaza and the Beseco beach. So this new renewed plaza space will provide a place for children to play and families to gather, while also accessing the beach and preserving that amenity for the community. So similar to the previous module, this module will also elevate the residential spaces above the ground level, while also providing increased density with 12 two-bedroom units. Within each module itself, you will have opportunities within each floor for communal gatherings and providing areas for families to come together and to have community potlucks. And they will also be optimized for passive systems to reduce the need for mechanical systems and intense HVAC systems by providing through ventilation, cross ventilation, and passive solar control through overhangs and a double skin facade. And these modules will be centered around the foundation of this Capital Community Center, which will provide a focal point for the community and prioritizing that central plaza space and acting as kind of a transition point between all the different axes that occur on the site. This community center will also feature a more expansive marketplace on the ground level, as well as flexible community rooms and an atrium space on the second floor, as well as smaller program uses like office spaces and a conference room and a library for the community. And this will serve as more of like an administrative center for things like the mangrove restoration and the mangrove nurseries that are adjacent to the building. And within this multifunctional space, that is the primary space of the Capital Community Center, this can serve as both an opportunity for indoor community gatherings and events, and also it can provide an area for emergency shelters in case people can't evacuate in time. They can come to this new focal point and where you can enjoy, not enjoy, but have essential services provided. So this new community center will exemplify some of the new material innovations that are based off of current practices and things being tested and experimented in the Philippines. One thing is the use of bamboo reinforced concrete to create the ground level of protection and elevation, which mounts the bamboo interior structure on the second and third floor. On the facades, it will feature the reused recycled plastics that have been compressed into eco-timber boards, and the roofs will be reminiscent of their surrounding context by reusing sheet metal that is commonly found in that area. So with the spatial planning, this allows for a lot of cross-ventilation and stack ventilation through the use of operable partitions on the facade and the double-height atrium, as well as using the overhangs to control the solar gain from the south and north solar because of the adjacency to the equator of the site. So in summation, this is a building and a community that can weather the storm, that can provide spaces that can shelter those who cannot get out of the way in time and let the floodwaters come in and then recede so that they can continue to grow and develop as a community that can strengthen itself in the times to come. And I would like to thank everyone for listening to my presentation, and I open the floor for comments and questions.
Wow. One question first. What's the sea level? What's the 100-year or 200-year flood level that you're designing for?
It's about
Like
2 meters.
2 meters?
During storm systems,
Yeah.
the storm surge can reach about 2 meters. So
Yeah.
that was the design.
Which is like what, 8 feet?
Yeah.
6 to 8 feet. Yeah. Wow. It'll take a minute to digest all of this. I guess the first thing I want to say is that I am transported. I really feel that you have taken me, to this place, and I begin to understand the challenges that you're facing. The other thing I would also just want to say is I thank you for including your process sketches the ones that are not as glamorous, because I think they're equally as powerful and they have just as strong as a place as some of this finished work as well. This is just really, I mean, this feels like a contextual solution. It feels like you understand, there is some informality that you've brought to this formal solution. It feels like it is born of a people and of a place. And yeah, just for me right now, I'll have to take it in. It's just all wow.
Thank you.
I second the wow. I guess just one question would be, I think it was on a previous question asked about a previous project about density. You talked about how dense this place is. So then how would you compare the kind of the denseness that you've created to that? Is it of a kind, or is it less, or, whatever? So that's just a question you can get to. But yeah, I mean, again, this is just like so compellingly, both, I think like representation is really high quality, but also just the thoughtfulness, the solutions, it feels like kind of starting on one end and going all the way to the other end. Even like your unit types, the kind of clarity of these modules and the way that they align, and the way that you distribute it on the site, it just very well put together. So I'm going to sit here and think about some other critiques, but that's what we'll start with.
Thank you. I could talk about the density or a little bit. So I basically went to match the density of the specific neighborhood. So it's about 65,000 people per square kilometer. So I basically tried to match that with the unit layouts and the amount of units that I included, which is about 96 two-bedroom units.
You have more kind of, taller packed units versus kind of the smaller, tighter pieces of infrastructure around it.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was very interesting. I echo the wow, I guess. I'm gonna set you on that. I think it was the idea that you had, breaking the cycle, starting from the analysis of your island, the natural phenomena that occur, all the way up to the design that includes the hazard mitigation. It works very well for me. So besides the sustainability, right, I was a little shocked to see how much in 22 years, right, starting from 2001 to 2023, how much density had occurred in this area. So obviously, right, that's not a type of sustainable growth for the environment, but you're certainly, with this design, you seem certainly to be mindful of how to protect and also, regulate the ecosystem in a certain way, in a traditional way. I think, speaking of the architecture, the part that I appreciated the most was, in fact, the hazard mitigation. So we're not trying to prevent the waters from coming in, because that would be ridiculous. We are actually using the traditional typology of building on stilts, because that's what used to work, and it was sustainable. So very well done. I also appreciate your model a lot. So I have a couple of questions just structurally regarding the bamboo trusses. If you could, I understand that you use the word trusses because there's like a reticulate system of wooden elements. I'm not sure exactly they work as trusses. So with the compression and with the tensile strength that trusses normally sustain, can you just walk me through it, maybe? Or not?
Well, I could try to speak to some of it.
Okay.
I did a lot of research into existing bamboo systems of larger kind of spaces that were used. Um, a lot of the kind of canon for bamboo, it tends to be like outdoor pavilions and these kind of like grand structures that have a lot of like ornate kind of bending moments and things that feel a lot more organic. So it was somewhat of an interesting challenge to kind of blend this organic nature of bamboo structures with the typology of very kind of modular like and more kind of controlled structure. I think there's definitely a lot more room to improve and to explore in actual bamboo structure itself. And I think it's an interesting opportunity to keep taking this project forward that way.
Yeah, very interesting. No, I think that if like you could keep these traditional materials, but also the airiness, the lightweight that bamboo, inspires. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's amazing. Congratulations. I like very much, and I was wondering why so great. So tell me if the answer could be possible. I think behind this work there is a lot of research about typology, about vernacular language, about local structure. You combine the three most important aspects also for the sustainable design, because when you look to the past, you find always the solution. And so I'm impressed from your site analysis, the sketching that you mentioned, the freehand sketch that tell us the knowledge that you have about the subject, the model, of course. So, but it's not just the style, language, structure, but this is architecture and urban planning. So you combine most of the aspect all together in the great work. So it's another wow, just to similar to my colleagues. Congratulations.
I'm not gonna break the wow cycle, so you get a fifth one from me. And if I were a developer, I would be having a conversation with you very seriously about what is that we're doing here, and I would take that as a really strong compliment because developers are tough people. I really like how you explain the story, and everyone said it. It's really backed up into a lot of research, and it really shows that you've done your homework here. So I'm sure you have all the answers to all of our questions. No? Yeah? Yeah? It's laughing. No, I think it shows in how you explain the story and how you choose your graphics for it. And it's from the little site analysis, you keep digging through every aspect and you prove that you know what you're doing. I appreciate the model a million times. I mean, in the times where it's very easy to put something on a computer, taking the time and doing a model that is extremely complicated, from what I'm saying, I think you need the highest praises. I wanted to ask a question. I know we talk about the sacrificial layer and we put things on stills because that's the way it used to work and that's the way it's probably gonna work, but could we at some point think if there's a way to save or to preserve that sacrificial layer a tad more than what we're doing here?
Yeah, I think that was definitely part of the initial thinking that I had going into this. I was doing some research into some of the work done I think it's in London, in the UK, maybe not London, but in the UK, where they have some examples of amphibious architecture that can just raise and lower with the actual tides. I was looking into that initially, but at the scale with having multiple unit types and figuring out whether or not it's safe for these all to start floating at once is another interesting challenge.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of studies in New Orleans about how to make the whole house float in the case of an event, right? So I think digging a little bit more into this and making your sacrificial layer smaller every time, could be a kind of powerful way to proceed in your studies, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for your presentation. It was very clear and you had a lot of thought put into the initial setup for the project, which is really nice to see. Speaking to that sort of, sacrificial lower layer, I almost wish you had a rendering that showed you know, when the water level is up high, what what does it look like?
Partially.
Oh yeah, the section perspective. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this is kind of the core of your project. And I wonder. I mean, I feel like you've made also a lot of very specific and intentional decisions about the tectonic system that you're using, the way that you're speaking to the local architecture of the place, and then even down to the detail of are those like shutters?
Yes. So it started out as a shutter system that was inspired by some of the vernacular kind of architecture. So they used to basically create wooden louvers that have seashell inserts called capish shells. So basically using that as a method of solar control. It started out as kind of like this swinging shutter system that you can see in some of those sketches down there. But in terms of the conversation with like storm resilience and having operable things that don't get blown away and kind of are more kind of structurally sound, that kind of sliding system, it was what they did in the past. So it seemed that that was probably a better system to have than something that pivoted.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like if there's something that I would like to see even more in your presentation or like in the way that you represent the project, it would be how you came to some of these different systems and like the kind of precedents that you were looking at, which might be a combination of what's already existing and what you've seen that works in other contexts where people are having to deal with similar storms. You know, I think the bamboo tectonics are like very compelling and very interesting and have like a whole lot of different angles, I guess, that you could pursue with them. So I'm like almost interested. Have you thought of, you know, were there ever other moments where you were like, no, I'm going to try a completely different truss system and see how that would affect the design of the buildings, or is it sort of like one thing that you landed on immediately and then it sort of like replicated itself within the project?
Initially, that trust system didn't actually exist. It really was just a project that looked into the residential modules, but then after doing a little bit more site analysis, it kind of led itself to being a project that needed this kind of center, something that could act as a focal point. And then that trust evolved a lot, and just kind of finding the different configurations like, oh, should it be 2 levels? Like, how does it connect to the concrete podium, the base, the sacrificial layer? It could definitely, I could definitely keep that going, just keep experimenting with how that trust comes together.
Yeah, yeah, I think I'd be interested in like how is this structural system a kind of module or like a way of thinking about building that can navigate all of these different sort of strata of environments where you have the water coming in, you have the mangroves, you have the floating pathways, and then you have the upper levels, and then of course you're limited by the length of bamboo, and just like I don't know if there's a way to sort of communicate it as rather than just one standalone building, as a kind of system that you employ all the way across the site and is therefore by extension a proposal for, you know, the entire broader community that could be that isn't necessarily specific to this one site. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be a really interesting exploration. Thank you.
This is really great. I want to talk a little bit about the storm resiliency. So you observe that there's a site wall there that functions to, you know, for floodwaters, right? And then you've taken the opposite approach, which is to work with a broad horizontal plane to plant that plane, right? So now you're working with a living system. You expanded what was once a beach or a coastal edge, and now you're planting it with mangroves, right? And that's dissipating wave energy. And so that's really great. So I think on the coastal side of your development, you're making the right move by expanding horizontally as opposed to thinking about a single catastrophically failing wall, right? I think there could be some more attention to how you're articulating the ground on the urban side of your development, in the plaza, in the street. I see what I would consider to be maybe nods to retaining basins or bioswales here. I see kind of thin lines that are planted. Some of them are curving, some of them are in straight lines. But I think there's an opportunity here to think about the times in between when the plaza is dry, like we see on the wall, and the time when it's flooded considerably, right? That actually there's going to be many more times in between probably both of those conditions. That's 25%, as extreme as this, right? Where there's actually a chance where there is some water infiltration in the plaza, but if you were to articulate the ground plane a bit more, meaning play with the topography of it, excavate and mound up and do some other things, you could actually start to develop a language of holding water, slowing down water, conveying water away from that site, so that it's not just kind of these two conditions, keeping it very dry, or just saying, you know what, we just have to wait for the floodwaters to recede. But there's actually, the kind of poetry and the poetic aspects or possibilities of holding water and doing something with it to enrich the public realm could start to be part of the language here as well.
Yeah, almost like celebrating that connection to the water just a bit more intentionally.
Right.
I think that's a really great idea.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to rebut any of that, if you want to speak to any kind of stormwater management that you're doing in the plaza, please do. I'm just telling you what I read there. But yeah.
I think you gave a pretty accurate reading of it. I think there are like rainwater management strategy in the plaza, but I think the way that it influences the actual forms taken in that landscaping, I think that could definitely take another pass if only had 3-4 more weeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You also mentioned, just staying on the topic of articulating the ground, you mentioned there was a hardscape plaza that was like right at the corner over there, right? Mm-hmm. It looks like you've erased it. It's replaced with this broad mangrove landscape. But I wonder about that. I wonder does it have to be all or nothing, right? Can there be some kind of, public space intervention within the mangrove space? And maybe it has to broaden a bit to accommodate that new use. But does it have to be erased? Because I imagine like the ability to kind of recreate along the edge right now is limited now to this pier experience, right? It's not nearly as generous as it once was, right? So I wonder can we have our cake and eat it too? Are there ways of kind of integrating some other landscape moves within the mangrove forest, still let it keep its efficacy as a wave management system, but also allow for public engagement as well? But overall, really amazing work.
Thank you.
Who wants it? There's some.
Hi, welcome to Phil Donahue Show. Thank you, Phil. Adrian, this is a beautifully drawn and modeled thesis presentation. I apologize, I missed your introduction of the project, but coming in just in the last 10 or 15 minutes, really pleased to see this work on the wall, especially the models. I have a question. It's not a critique. It's more of a question about looks like there's 3 groups of housing around this community building. And did you look at the scale relationship between those smaller parts of your program and the existing fabric and the registration of it? There's this kind of ad hoc nature to the existing fabric. And so those are just questions I have.
So in terms of the relationship to the existing fabric, I did try to take some of the pre-existing axes and just let them breathe or at least define them more with the spaces created. With the use of the different modules around the community center, I think the intention of those was to create kind of separated pocket parks that were more kind of bounded by residential to give them more of like a communal ownership over those open spaces and those gardens behind them.
What about the scale of them? Had you thought about breaking them down to maybe 2/3 or half their size so they were more in relationship with what was the existing fabric?
Yeah, so I did some explorations of within like the residential modules and how those units were I guess conglomerated. I think the challenge is with the existing spaces and the existing fabric. They're extremely dense, and sometimes it's hard to get a reading on exactly how those are laid out. Like some of the units directly to the south of the Baja Batayo units, they seem to have like very limited kind of access to natural light and air. So I think as a critique, I wanted to try and find a new module that could prioritize these kind of things that are found really easily in vernacular architecture.
I'm going to jump in real quick and just comment on the visual presentation, which people have recognized is quite exquisite. Having had the past 25 or so years meeting with students who, particularly undergraduates, because they're immensely naive, have this idea that the most important thing that they can do is to learn how to run an application. There's, as you know, a fixation for BIM, which is about to die. But there's this idea that that's going to deliver them from the evils of design. And going back to the comment that was made at the very beginning, you know, one of the things that Adrian does quite wonderfully is he knows how to draw. Drawing's not dead. In fact, the reason this is such a beautiful project in my mind is that because he can visualize with his hands, he can also visualize in the box and make the computer do what he wants it to do, not what it wants to do. And if you go up and look closely at these drawings, the drawings are all humanized. The digital outputs have been humanized even before they were output by Adrian's hand. And as a consequence of that, this stuff it has that human touch to it. At the end of the day, it has a natural touch to it that you don't get if you just allow the application to output it alone. So I just wanted to make that as a kind of commentary for those people in the back of the room who might be doing a thesis next year. Guys up front, it might get tough.
Thank you.
It's too early to stop.
Tell us what you would do next.
Probably find some structural engineers. I think something that was a really big question mark, or has been, is the idea of like the bamboo reinforced concrete. That's something I kind of hyper fixated on halfway through, and like I think we had some issue. I had some issues, I guess, figuring out the usage of concrete within a project like this as a material that's very, I guess the typical canon of it is very not in line with kind of ecological design and sustainable design. But I think kind of finding avenues for the use of something that can weather storms and is resilient in terms of its physical qualities, and kind of bringing that in line with the kind of resilience of the community and the other sustainability aspects.
I would say one other thing too, to add on to what Peter was talking about, is like the scale. I think it's a really interesting question. One of the things I was kind of expecting you to say was that, oh, well, I looked at, and I think you didn't really do that in the beginning. It's like kind of talked about, you're talking about the scale of what's there now, and it's like incredibly dense, very small, kind of somewhat ad hoc. It might be interesting to have shown us, or have also been looking at, and you probably did, other like good urban scale buildings in Manila that are the scale that you're using. So like kind of tracking that thing, because maybe your argument is the stuff that's over here isn't sustainable, or it isn't what you want people to be living in. You know, you want to give them something better, and this is a better model. And then thinking about how that would, I like this, the kind of future expansion diagram. I could also imagine like what happens if you start to like, it starts to spread the other way, like across, you know, more across. And then one really quick question, I don't know anything about this, but mangroves, what's your sense of like, when we looked at the aerial photograph, there's not a lot, and I know there's this nursery, so like, what's your sense of the real viability of like repopulating mangroves, and like given our issues with, you know, sea, you know, the heating of the oceans and things like that, like is that legitimate?
I believe it's legitimate. I think there are definitely some challenges with mangrove reforestation in kind of modeling the natural patterns of growth of mangrove forests. I think the biggest challenge in terms of reforestation is that people tend to just carpet bomb seedlings, essentially, and that isn't really how forests grow. I think the challenge would be to just bringing this kind of knowledge that used to be kind of prioritized and kind of nurturing for the natural environment and bringing that into these new residences and this new community so that they can basically support the natural environment as the natural environment supports them.
And in answer to your question, answering him, which stems back to Daniela's question, I think you already knew that the structure of particularly the truss required further thought. Now, you may not have done the calculations, but if you compare that single bent to what ends up in the final model, there's much more elaboration on what's going on in that bottom chord, which you're struggling to solve, even though it may not be ultimately the solution. So that you're already thinking that you need to call that structural engineer right away.
Very quickly, I would like to point the attention about not only your skill, but also your sensibility, also in terms of maintenance. Just an example, I think the cantilever roof is also come from the tradition, of course, but it's a very interesting way to preserve the facade, you know, from the water condition, especially because you have this incredible, actually, I would like to see if you pass this one, because this is another aspect that he wants that he designed it. Is a very interesting detail about the facade, and such as so detail. I think it's interesting that you preserve, you know, from the cantilever roof over there. So I appreciate a lot of aspect, also the detail.
Thank you.
I was wondering, did you ever consider putting paths between the buildings that would be usable when the water levels are high?
That is an excellent point. I think that would be a great second iteration to keep going on this. I think definitely that kind of connections between the second level is definitely something that I could keep exploring.
I just wanted to maybe, you know, in Venice we do that only when we need it. Like they put planks up. So when the water's not flooding, you don't have them. When it is flooding, they pull out the planks and, you know, highly movable structures.
Just because I wanted to point out too, I was just looking as I was thinking about this. I think the one piece we were just talking about, this kind of scale relationship to the adjacent. The more now that I'm thinking about it, like you can see that like every time you represent it, it's represented as white boxes with no reality. So like this perspective right here, if you were to draw kind of what's there, I think you would start to realize like that you've created an issue that you'd have to think through a little bit. And it kind of happens in every drawing. So I think the kind of relationship to the immediate context and like your thoughts on that would be another piece to dive deeper onto.
That's it.
Oh, no, I know. I'm doing it. Well, I'm kind of a little speechless too. I was trying to figure out what to say here, but yeah. So I think I just want to emphasize and not reiterate, to agree with what's been said already, and to say how much fun I had working with you this semester and last semester. And I really appreciate how thorough you were in digging into this, into the research about the place, the history, the drawings that you made by watching the video of those new townhouses being constructed, like all the way down to the aerial, that video you were watching to really kind of get a sense of the place. And then I also appreciate the analysis you did of the vernacular housing to inform this, and to kind of really ground it in the place. And there is that whole area of thought about sustainability to kind of look to traditional ecological knowledge, where people really understood much better how to live in the climates and the places where they live. So I think that's a great technique and strategy to be carrying forward no matter where you work. I also want to appreciate how nimble and flexible you were in this project. That early on, at the beginning of the project, a reviewer questioned your choice of site, which was not this site; it was a different site that Adrian had already documented to within an inch of its life. And I was like, oh, and within the next meeting, he was already down here looking at this site. So I thought that was a great choice for so many reasons. And of course, there've already been comments made about your talent. I mean, you just bring a lot of horsepower to this work, and you employed it very well. And your curiosity, that you just tested ideas, tested and tested through drawing, through model, through analysis and research, and you sort of never stopped. And I just always appreciated the curiosity that went into that level of design, and that will also serve you well. And I would just want to say at the end of this that for my money, the purpose of Thesis, so the best theses, they raise these difficult questions. Like the questions that you raised are the questions of our time, no matter where you work, whether it's in Manila or Annapolis or, Paris, I don't know, like I'm trying to think, anywhere in the world that has water. With most projects, whether these projects find any actual answers isn't really, it's definitely not guaranteed, and it's often not the point. At the end of the day, we sort of have these great discussions, and it's often actually not even necessary, that the questions are going to carry you through your career. But I think in this case, you took this project far enough that there are some viable answers here, and some viable sort of practice directions for you. And I guess I'll forgive you for not reaching out to the structural engineer after I sent you that 3-way email. But you have his name and you have his email, and I'm sure he would love to hear from you, especially now with all this that you have to show him. So congratulations.
Thank you.
I can do it. Okay, great. Congratulations, Adrian. We're going to actually stay here. The jury will stay here. We're going to rotate the boards quickly. So if any students can help rotate the boards, I'm going to make some announcements. Faculty, you have rec forms in your email. If you're not a faculty member, you can drown all this out. You have rec forms in your email, do them. If you're the chair of a committee, you'll get the rec forms last, so don't worry if you haven't gotten your rec form yet. That's one announcement. Another announcement is for faculty. We are meeting after the last review today, so we'll be meeting at 5:30ish after we wrap up, 5:15ish, upstairs in the office to do our annual meeting thing. So go up there after we meet here. Don't leave at the end of the day. Any other announcements to make? Okay. We'll be back in a few minutes. The great space. We're going to begin in just a minute. Okay, we are going to kick off our second presentation of the afternoon. I'll stop standing in front of it. We have Chase, who is chaired by Michael Espon.
Hello, hello. Thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. Thank you to my chair, Professor Esbon, Professor May, and Professor Noonan for helping me through this process. My thesis is fragmented. So fragmented refers to two words, fragmented and mended. And through this process, I have this ethos of using architecture and architectural systems and landscape systems to begin to fragment both physical, local ecologies to a regional scale, and also culturally connecting children's experiences more to nature to hopefully instill future ecological consciousness in them. So the project itself, the context begins at a very large regional scale. This diagram here that you're seeing shows the growth of the built environment over time. So the darker blue is older developments and the lighter blue are newer developments, contrasted with the current forest cover. And these two systems work in tandem together, but the urban sprawl begins to fragment these ecologies and break them down. So looking at a closer regional scale, close to UMD, this is the DMV region, there's this green belt around the city, or around this region, that's containing the urban growth. But when you look closer, there are lots of fragmented patches throughout this landscape. So in ecological terms, we can break down these landscapes into first a patch, which is a certain type of homogeneous zone, like a forest, that creates an ecosystem. But it's not as simple as that, as there are matrices throughout all of this that are big lawns and parks and agricultural reserves that are still built to an extent, but can still hold natural life. And then perhaps the most important structure for this thesis is corridor structures that run through the built environment, connecting these local ecologies to a more regional scale. So the problem of our this thesis is the disconnection of these local habitats and how urban sprawl then begins to disconnect children from nature as they have little to no access because of sprawling roads and disconnections. So here, this map depicts a few of these disconnections of regional and local corridors, and I've chosen to focus on one in particular. So that ecology is around Great Seneca Creek, which connects down into the Potomac watershed, and it's around the city of Gaithersburg. So this plot of land here in 2005 was majority covered in forest cover. There was the Montgomery Abandoned Motor Unit, which is where the county keeps abandoned vehicles, which is still running today. But over time, this ecology and tributary of Great Seneca Creek began to be fragmented with the addition of Watkins Mill Road and the creation of these two communities. Then more recently, the Watkins Mill interchange was built, destroying a large part of the forested corridor to the north, further disconnecting Brown Station Park, which is that light green patch on the bottom. So taking consideration of the overall study area, it's contained by a PEPCO easement to the northwest, I-270, and a railroad, as well as it has Watkins Mill Road running through the center of it. But there are lots of natural features to this plot of land as well, including the hydrologic features like the floodplain to the north and an existing very patchy forest cover. But this land is not just for humans. There are also plenty of living life, both avian and mammal, that circulate through the site that we are breaking with urban sprawl. So these are photos from the site where the intervention itself, the learning landscape will be, is currently a pretty barren patch, but there are still life going on. These were all photos from the site. So on the top right, we see a coyote, which is a little scary to see. There's also white-tailed deer, which are less scary to see. But this brings me to my question of how can the defragmentation of habitats and urban sprawl cultivate ecological consciousness for future generations? So how can mending these ecologies and providing spaces for children to learn in nature revitalize their ecological consciousness and allow them to grow into more sustainable people? The general site approach is to take these fragmented patches of forest and reinforce them with corridor structures and patch restoration techniques to ultimately come to a more fragmented landscape. In a bit more detail, here are the existing forest patches and how the corridor structures can overlay into them, ultimately turning into a more fragmented and brought together landscape. Here is an aerial before the intervention, and then afterwards it becomes much more verdant, connected, and one ecological tissue rather than a bunch of fragmented ecologies. Here's a site plan of the project. I call the center the learning landscape, which is a series of pavilions. But before we get into that, there's some phasing. So to lay out the organization of the project, I wanted to merge both the structural systems of the architecture and the planting systems of this nursery landscape into one. So I used a 24-foot on-center grid to accommodate both of those structures. So in phase one would be the planting of those trees and the erection of some structural elements that could later be grown into anticipating the addition of future architecture moving down the stages. So in this plan, you can see how with the strategic planting of trees, we can create different open spaces and anticipate the architecture being built and put into the landscape. In the final phase would be the opening of this project where it becomes activated with daytime programming. This is a place that you would go on a school field trip in elementary school. So within the landscape, as I mentioned, there are a series of pavilions and experiences organized about 3 different episodes that I'd like to take you through. So first, you would arrive at the Arrival Grove. This is where we have the majority of the enclosed space. So there's an administration wing and the main arrival center. And as you approach this zone, you come through a boardwalk, walking between these two masses, a classroom to the left and administration wing to the right. Straightforward would be the lobby space. So the interior of the building is broken down into 3 masses, as I mentioned, the classroom, administration, and then more of a lobby/interfacing space for exhibition spaces and different learning activities. Here's a rendering of inside of the lobby. The architectural language begins to blend with the outdoor pergola structures and creates this melding of inside and out. As we transition out of the arrival grove, you're met with this holistic transitional landscape full of paths and choices to make and experiences to have. The paths are broken down into two different structures: dirt, floor, gravel paths on grade, and then a raised boardwalk structure in the darker gray on the top right. Many of the pavilions are hosted on this boardwalk structure, and it's used to organize the project. The next stop that you'd make is the Learning Glade episode, which is a clearing in the project with a large pollinator garden that symbiotically works with orchards and the nursery in the project. There's also a large structure called the Learning Pavilion, which is pictured on the left, which is an open air framed structure that has one enclosed classroom on it. And then in the rear behind that, we can see a boardwalk going over a water feature that adds to the overall episode. Inside the space, there are cutouts on the ground floor for different ground textures and natural experiences to get down and dirty with the environment. And there's also these trees that, since they have been planted earlier, can be mature and grown into these structures. Walking away from the Learning Glade, you would see these two classrooms built off of this boardwalk with the water walk in the back. Each of these classrooms uses a modular mass timber design. So they all look a little different, but they use the same kit of parts generally and begin to blend in with the tree plantings around. This drawing just highlights the parts a bit more. Then finally, the last stop would be the Performance Arboretum, which is an outdoor performance space for the children. What we're seeing here is willow stage. So planting a willow tree into a large courtyard area gives a setting and a space for kids to perform their tree stories or anything that they've learned about nature through a more poetic lens, which can help them create meaning and connections to the environment that will take them into adulthood. And then finally, this last slide shows the character arboretum, which is where, like, I'm showing a birch tree and a cherry blossom tree, and every tree has a different story and different qualities and characteristics that I'd like children to learn about and relate to. So it's almost like a repertoire of characters that you can draw from in your performances. And then at the left, we see the woodland corridor and how it begins to merge and like feather into the built environment. So thank you so much. I would appreciate any questions or comments.
I mean, once again, I'm not going to say wow, but I am going to say I mean, these drawings are ridiculously good. Like, they're just so good. And I think that, I mean, I'm envious. They're beautifully drawn. I guess I think the thing that I don't really understand, part of it, I see like I like the diagram that you did where you did the kind of like existing aerial and then the kind of mended aerial, but I don't understand, if you're trying to kind of reconnect natural ecosystems, there's still kind of the road coming through. Have you addressed connecting across the roads for wildlife, things like that? So I'd like to understand that more. And then I think this is just one where, did you get tired of the grid at all? Like, I want you to have moved one of the columns like 2 feet to the left and up 6 inches or something. I feel Yeah, for being about ecology, and I get like fundamentally cell structure and chaos theory and all that stuff. It's all a grid anyway. It's the matrix. But I do really wish there was like one moment or something that where it's like Michelangelo like taking the Renaissance and then starting to break the rules ever so subtly. So that would be my main critique, and then just wanting to understand how you are really making ecological connections further afield than your site.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions. So on the first one about Watkins Mill Road that cuts through the site, in my explorations to find ways to cross that road, that was such a challenging feat. And it ultimately seemed a bit impossible, like upon site visits and looking at the topography, because although I didn't talk about topography too much, it does stop animals from crossing the road at a certain point closer to the railroad. So really the only spots that I was finding like game trails of like animals moving were along the floodplain corridor. So I ran with that as like, this is the connection. And then the second part of your question of did I get bored with the grid? Definitely went insane with the grid, trying to get it to all pair up between the different drawings. But I do hear your critique of maybe different areas that break the rules, because I think that's like a really great idea. And it's something that I wanted to do. And there's a little bit of evidence, like the willow tree isn't on the grid center because it's a unique, different thing. And there's also like the forest play area close to the Arrival Grove. I didn't talk much about it, but yeah, let me come out. So over here, labeled number 3, is the play structure, like forest. So it's like a faux forest where the trees aren't on that grid. So there are, in the beginning, there were these intentional breaks from the grid, but it definitely got lost in the overall system.
And I mean, I have a yard that I love my yard, hate my yard, I can't control it. So like, I'm just looking at this like, eventually your grid of trees is no longer going to be a grid of trees.
Well,
Okay.
that's perfect. Yeah. So through like succession and just time, this grid, especially in the lower maintained areas like the wilderness corridor, woodland corridor, would begin to degrid themselves very naturally, and that is expected. While the core of the landscape that's more inhabited and used for program could be maintained more in that grid.
On the subject of trees, did you, I don't know, talk to a horticulturalist, or do you have an idea of what species you're placing here? And then maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Like every 24 feet, for the most part, is a tree. I mean, it's a very heavy-handed way to introduce nature back to children, because you've jailed the trees.
Yeah, no, that's
in a way, and it feels a little heavy-handed. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Also, I know it's 3 questions in one, but also in the section, there seems to be some intention for having taller trees or more mature trees in some areas than others. So
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully, I got all
Okay,
that.
species is and why what in particular species where?
Yeah.
That's
So
the first one.
for the majority of the project, I was using, well, all the project are like native Maryland species, except for that cherry blossom. We'll not remember that one. But I used tulip poplars for all of these because they grow straight
But they
and
go
they grow
straight,
up.
yeah.
And they grow quickly too.
But they don't have any.
But they, I mean,
They don't.
yeah.
They
But then,
don't- they're not
then
very
closer,
rounded. They're
not very
polygonal.
rounded.
Yeah.
But then closer to, like, speaking of like different species.
Yeah.
There's oaks and elms and larger trees that couldn't grow in the framework, planted closer to like the revitalized habitat, because there are 2 important patches here that are filled with those types of trees currently. And then there's a third question.
Yeah. about the different heights.
The different heights.
Yeah. If there was- well, you kind of answered it.
Yeah. Well, I'm also trying to represent growth over time too. So, like these trees would be older in this part of the section, so they're a bit taller. Like a project like this grows over time, so I had to freeze the project at some point and be like, in 2040, this is what it's going to look like.
Well, I guess to respond to that, I mean, if it were something like tulip poplars or closer to the building structures, and then because they are more containable, and then you expanded it to different species as you went further away because those trees are less containable. This diagram might not be as covered in green closer to the buildings than you're showing right now. So that's just sort of a comment, to think about. I mean, the plants are part of the, what do you call it? They're one of the actors in this whole experience that you're planning.
Yeah.
So just sort of be mindful of their shape and if you're going to be, it looks like you've made a great decision or a fine decision that you're going to contain them every 24 feet. Then so I would love to be able to understand that you made a decision to put easily containable species closer to the buildings, and then ones that are more aggressive or wider in caliber, further out.
Yeah, that's great.
There's
Jump in for a second. I'll say wow, because I think it deserves a wow as well. I think that there is a more relaxed order than the graphic will allow us to see. So the graphic is relentless, particularly this big plan here, and less so in the ones up above that show the episode. But I just have to say that I love the fact that it is like pulling teeth after 40 years of teaching architecture. It is like pulling teeth to get students of architecture to understand that landscape is perhaps even more interesting than architecture itself, and that the second landscape of architecture needs to always be drawn with that first landscape together. And this is a complete merging of those things, utilizing something that harkens back. At some point, there was a rendering that we saw that reminded me of case study houses in California, that kind of merging of landscape and the built. And I think that is a fabulous thing. The other thing is that I spent last Friday talking with former Dean Steve Hurt, who is an incredible intellect. And we were talking about the fact that most of the teaching of architecture in the École des Beaux-Arts valued the interplay between building and landscape, between mosaic, the pattern of the floor of the building, and the entourage, the landscape. And so if this white grid was taken away and we were able to see the episodes of building and the interconnective tissue and allow the landscape to read a little bit more representationally, as opposed to the abstraction you've overlaid on top of it. I get the abstraction. I just want to see it so that I can just feel that play between the building and the landscape a little bit more. Just loosen the reins slightly on us and allow us to read it. You're reading it back to us.
Yeah, I'm telling you. Yeah.
Great job.
Thank you.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because is this working? Yeah. I was just thinking, like, it seems like you so strategically denied us the architectural figure ground, right? Yeah. Like, I am struggling to understand the silhouette or like the footprint of the architecture. And at first that made me feel lost and like, I just don't get it. And then I realized, okay, that's totally intentional. He's inversing the figure ground. And the job really is to figure that out and understand that the trees are the figure ground. So you're pushing the grid to the surface so that we see that matrix. And there's a kind of like nuance and subtlety that I really appreciate, that you're forcing us out of the architectural figure ground. And I'm also really curious if you looked at Andrea Branzi's work
The Weak Urbanism.
No, I haven't.
You should totally check it out because it's, he proposes weak urbanism, this sort of grid-based, landscape-based urbanism for suburbs, but also, agricultural tracts. Okay. And some of your perspectives and the way that you're kind of like loosely creating pavilions and grouping together, pieces to create architecture really remind me of some of his renderings, so you should check it out. Yeah.
I'll give it to you in 1 second, but as a direct response to that, I found myself looking at the perspectives because the minute I saw this dense drawing in the middle, I was going, okay, he's hiding something there. I can't find the figure either. The perspective, thank God the perspectives are so clear. And for me, they're like mid-century modern clarity to them and beauty to them. And they allow me to understand that relationship of figure and ground. And I understand it's very rich, but he's being very stingy with allowing that in the middle there. So,
thanks. What a beautiful project. I could just lose myself in it. You are inspiring me, though, to think about, wow, how could it have been different? And so forgive me if I talk for a minute or two about that. I realize that in all of your luscious perspectives, we're in an architectural space. And I wonder, if you're introducing children to the wonders of nature, if you wouldn't want them to move in between an architectural space and an outdoor room that was a forest room, a forest glade where some of the trees have died away, the sun is coming in, all of the kind of multisensory aspects of architecture are present in those rooms that are made by the landscapes and sometimes shaped by the animals in the landscapes. So I'm just wondering about that. When we go out into nature, do we always have to experience it through the lens of architecture, or could we experience it, as a kind of contrast between the homes that are, the habitations that humans make and the ones that the animals live in? The next thought was, well, okay, so what other attitudes are there? So you can make the landscape like architecture. So, architecture's gridded, landscape's gridded. Well, you can say, okay, landscape's organic, so we'll make the architecture curvy, like Grace Farms. Did you look at that when you were?
I haven't.
Oh, look at Grace Farms. I think you will love it. But it's a curving response to to nature. You can bring the nature into the architecture the way you did here. You can view the nature from the architecture and look back at the architecture from the nature. I'm probably forgetting a few things, but I think that you've taken a very strong position here, and I just I want to make sure that as you go forward in your career, I'm sure you're going to be working in this area. Just want to make sure that you think about all the different positions. And finally, one last thing is that aspect of time. And it would be lovely to see that represented here. How will the architecture change? And as the landscape grows up and then dies, some of it will die, it will also change and continue to support wildlife in all kinds of different ways. So I think that's one of the joys of doing a landscape project is that time is absolutely part of the design process, and one where you have to kind of like relinquish control at some point. So landscape architecture degree next?
I don't think so.
No, do it, absolutely do it. The other thing that just got me excited about this is that I've had for the past 50 years a fantasy about designing a house that's not for a client, simply for my own satisfaction. It's a house of the Four Seasons. And I'd have Vivaldi playing in the background, and then I would be designing this house. And then it would obviously be a quadripartite house, right? There'd be 4 different gardens, and each garden would be tuned to the season, but it'd also be tuned to the times of day. And that's the thing that I think would be interesting to think about 4:30 this morning, the birds were already chirping outside of my window. You could see the sky starting to light up. There was a deer on the front lawn of my building on Connecticut Avenue. I'm thinking that understanding this in terms of the daily cycle, in terms of the seasonal cycle. So I would encourage you, among other things, to redo a couple of these things in different times of the year. Understand what it's like to be out there when it's snow. Well, if we ever have snow again, what it might be like.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question that's based on, I think, a lot of things we've talked about over the course of this semester in your presentations. In hearing the way people are talking about it today and knowing how we've talked about it in the past, I want to, or I'd love to hear you talk about what you're hearing in people's reading of your project as binary. Like this is landscape area and this is where's the architecture?
Yeah.
Or we talked a lot about, or the three of us talked a lot about what is the definition of architecture, and can doing a grid of trees be architecture, and when does it? So I think I'm hearing a lot of binary language, like this is inside and this is outside, or this is when you're in architecture and this is when you're in nature, and is that what you think of your project? Is that, I mean, between the lenses of time and space and growing and indoor and outdoor, maybe there's other readings that you've come to.
It's such a challenging question because I do take these two systems, architectural and natural, put them on a similar system. So it's easy to read like a dichotomy between the two. But for me, putting them on the same system was about melding them together and making it into one system that are codependent and unable to be removed from each other. So I did notice that like it was a bit of speaking of like the tree and then the architecture, but it's there. But I think if you read it a little deeper, it's about like the mending and the collaboration of these systems together and how they can't be independent from each other.
So the architecture degree is enough, is what you're saying, maybe.
It's enough. I'm done.
Chase, I just want to echo everyone's comments about what a beautiful project this is. And I wanted to build on Brian's comment in this aspect of time. If you had another month, I would love for you to get into the tectonics of the buildings even more, because I'm really impressed with the sort of the nature of the spaces and what you're implying through the architectural expression. And I would love to learn more about the systems and the fasteners and how this could be modular and how it could actually work with the landscape in terms of, I don't know, you've set up sort of a master plan, and how could these pieces come in a way that doesn't disrupt things, and people can use an air spade to get some helical piles in there or something so that you don't damage the growth. And I'm also curious too about this aspect of time and how, you're showing lots of wood, and wood will, in the exterior, will degrade over time, and it'll weather, I think, in ways that could be pretty beautiful, and to sort of go along with your ideas about how the landscape ages, that the buildings would age too, and that they could work together with each other.
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful concept. Time was a really large theme in this project for a long time. There were original ideas about how the space can be replanted, and since it's a nursery, trees can be removed and there's new open spaces. So it's definitely a theme that's been thought through, less about like the longevity of the architecture. It hasn't been. The primary consideration to that would be using like all wood fastener mass timber. Like by removing the glue laminated mass timber from it, it would age like more effectively outside, which kind of goes against your point of like the natural beauty of aging. But there was thought behind like a structural system that can be used as these outdoor sculptural systems, but also be used as a building system that could be added to in the future. For example, over here, there's some framework laid out that could be enclosed later for future extensions of this Arrival Grove Center. So time is a huge theme in this, but graphically it's so challenging to show. Definitely made my attempts with phasing and stuff, but it's challenging to, yeah, there's only so much.
I'm still mesmerized by this drawing. I think, I don't know, I'm totally like, I can't stop looking at it. And I think obviously it's the power of the grid, right? And I know some people have been, thinking you should break the rules, but I think your project is exactly about not breaking the rules, and then let nature do itself whenever it happens over time. And we've been talking also about this duality between landscape and architecture and the two systems co-working at the same time. I wonder how much of it you can actually then bring into the architecture itself. And I think that's the part that's less explored in this project is, and we were talking about it for a second here, but what the buildings are. And you're already kind of like anticipating a lot of areas that are not architecture, not landscape. They're that gray zone in between both that I think they're extremely compelling. And I would really want to see develop even more because that's, I think, the meat of the project could totally be there too.
Like the clarity of the architecture. Okay, thank you.
I would like to echo that I also enjoy the grid and enjoy that you're holding yourself fast to that. And I think that speaking to comments about time and ways of expressing that within your project, I feel like you could almost use like you've thought through this system of planting and of building, in which planting and building become one and the same and are using the same metrics to disperse themselves across the site. But then I feel like you could add another layer that is sort of the after architecture layer that's a sort of purely imaginative, where do the game trails go? How does that disrupt what has, and it's not saying that like you're not designing it as the architect, you're just imagining it as the, as the future deer that are coming through the site, as the coyotes, as also, I think there's also a whole lot of similarities between the way that animals interact with a site and the way that people interact with a site, right? Like people are gonna cut through the parking lot and then kids are gonna make a mess in one corner. So I think there's like this wonderful sort of tension that you can set up between like, here's a designed area and then here's how it transforms and how the design allows you, because it's so regimented, it almost showcases those transformations more because you can see that contrast. And I feel like these are things that, I know when you're producing so much stuff, it's very hard to like, you definitely, it's helpful to have it frozen in one particular time. And I think it's very useful where you've frozen it. But I think you could even just sort of express this narrative through like a few smaller vignettes where you're just kind of taking your system and being like, what could this be 30 years from now? And how can it show how the initial design intervention is like supporting all of these potential variable futures?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I'm curious if you owned this tie before you started the presentation, or did you purchase this after you developed your grid?
It's my dad's tie.
Thanks, Dad.
I went shopping in his closet. So.
It's a beautifully drawn project, and I have the same kind of question that Lindsay raised, that I'm really interested in this kind of binary relationship between the landscape and the architecture. And I'm right with Brian on the case study houses. And Britt, I don't think he needs another month on the buildings. I'm more interested in the landscape. And your project reminds me of two experiences, one academic, well, both academic, but one had to do with travel. And I want you to take a look at the Asplund Cemetery in Stockholm. And he was an architect, but the most powerful parts of that landscape and that experience to me are how he just made a path through the woods. And So when I look at your project, I'm wondering, there are these kind of boardwalk type things, but are there times when the kids and the dads and the moms can get down on just a path? Because it's my contention that architecture can just be a path in the woods. And then the other project I'm reminded of is there are these pamphlet architecture books that were hot in the 80s and the 90s. And there's this one published by Mike Cadwell, and it reminds me of Brian's house that he wants to make. There's a little project booklet called Small Buildings. And he did a thesis, and then he went out and built these 4 little things that he called the Pastoral Quartet, one for each of the seasons. They're just follies out in the landscape. And what they investigated was the relationship to the all 4 seasons, but they also looked at the kind of sectional relationship. And so there was this ark, little boat that he put way up in the trees, and then there were things that were on the ground, and then there were some that were buried into the ground. And so if you were to continue for a month on the tectonic stuff that Britt wants you to do, I would want you to investigate this thing more aggressive sectionally in the same way you've explored it in the planimetric mode.
Oh,
Yeah, do you want to say something
no,
before
I'm
someone
good.
else says something?
Well, I guess speaking on one point, a majority of the paths are like those ground dirt paths. Like the boardwalk path is a different, like that's the more like heightened experience. Like that's a different, like the most normal is the dirt paths. Small.
Hi.
Hello.
So this is purely about image. I'm also just so drawn to that center image, and I've been thinking and looking at it and thinking why. On one level, I see it as like a tapestry with a kind of warp and a weft. And then some of the things that you did, which were representational, like having the translucent piece on the top and on the bottom over, starts also to make me think about the conversation about transparency and phenomenological transparency and actual transparency. And then another layer, I'm starting to see at a different scale actually, is the Barcelona pavilion.
That was a huge.
So it's like changing scales. And I'm just sharing some associations. I've also been thinking about the picture of Dorian Gray, and that, you know, if this image could change with the seasons and over time, and that structure would still be there, and I'd be watching it. So I'm just keep looking at that and have been just so moved by that image and the richness of it. It's let my imagination really grow, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it might be just fine to have some pieces of the structure fall into decay over time, just to respond to Brittany's comment before. One is I think that the issue of understanding the landscape could be completely resolved if you were to thread all of these vignettes together and create a film where we actually moved through this. Yeah. Because in a way, I'm looking at this and I keep thinking, we're looking at a storyboard for a great movie. I really want to see the movie, but this is just the storyboard at the moment. Have you ever seen Spring, Summer, Fall? It's a Korean film.
No.
I have the DVD if you can find a DVD player for it. But I mean, it's sublime. I used to make everybody watch it. You know, it's a great film. I was thinking you need to do 2 things. This one thing is going to be distasteful because it involves going to Indiana. But you need to go. You're not from Indiana, are you?
No, I'm not. I'm from Maryland.
But you need to go to Columbus, Indiana, and you need to go to the Miller House. And the Miller House was designed by Saarinen and Kevin Roche. But importantly, everything was corrected by Dan Kiley, the landscape architect. And what's interesting there is the idea of grid and then episode, meaning not grid. And that might be something that might be a gateway drug, okay? Then keep going west. Go to West Hollywood, okay? Go to the Kings Road, West Hollywood, the Schindler House in West Hollywood, where that is my fantasy. I mean, but you have to go back in time and understand Schindler's fantasy. Schindler built this house at a point in time when it was an orange grove. And the house and the landscape and the building are indistinguishable from one another. You can't tell if you're inside or outside any of the time. And it's perfect for me being slightly dyslexic because then I can be outdoors. And I actually built these pavilions on the top of the house for sleeping because the weather was so wonderful and you could sleep under the stars. But you really need to see that because I think that's an extension of this. So Mom and Dad, you're gonna have to get them a trip, a road trip going there. Yep.
Sorry. Yeah, well, I'm glad to be at this point.
Other comments, feedback?
Chase, this is great. Super fun. I'm thinking back to Thesis Match when you were telling me about this as I think you were using the word, a Greenway project, and it was based in Gaithersburg. And I was like, oh, it's one of those hometown projects. Uh-oh, that could be sticky. But what I like about this, because I'm a kid from the suburbs too, in Virginia, but I grew up in the same kind of fragmented landscape that you did, right? But what I appreciate about this is you took on the need to find a new language to describe a place, a landscape that you were very familiar with, right? So you kind of needed a whole new set of terms and terminology and ways of thinking, and you were game for that, to kind of reinvent your own idea of where you came from. And from that place, you were able to put together a proposal that is, probably not anything close to what you might have been thinking when you were a kid growing up in a place like this, right? But what I appreciate about the work is that it's about a small place in Gaithersburg, and then as you showed us at the start, this is a tactic for a condition that we find up and down the Northeast Corridor here in America, right? Fragmentation, woodland fragmentation particularly. And the second point I wanted to make was that I can't believe nobody wanted to talk about time. I'm kidding. Yeah, I'm kidding. It seemed like that is the through line connecting every comment. Everybody's interested in how this gets animated and enriched through the question of time. It's part of the conversations we had at one point. There was going to be an animation. You remember this? Your ambition for an animation that would move us through 40, 50, 60 years as trees fall out, as clearings thicken with trees, as columns start to fall, as trees fall and they become nurse logs and enrich other habitats and ecologies. So I fully endorse another 4 weeks where this stuff gets enriched and you take us through past 2040 to 2060 to 2080, and you animate this in the way where the grid becomes released a bit through succession, through trees falling out, through other critters coming to embed themselves here. And then we get at what Sarah is calling the variable futures, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, the kind of promise of this work. But it was a real joy, and thank you very much for bringing me along with this.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations. Okay, we're going to rotate 90 degrees to our final thesis presentation. again. So this will be our final presentation for our 3 days of thesis reviews. After this presentation, we'll take a few minutes. We'll take a few minutes all together to do a little bit of a recap, report out. We'll hear from the jury if they have any macro thoughts they want to share. So after this presentation, we'll take a few minutes to hear from the jury on macro reflections, thoughts, observations from the day. We've had a couple jurors here multiple days, so lots of great perspectives. And of course, if any faculty or students or guests want to participate, we'll have a wrap-up conversation after this. And with that, we'll pass it to Sam for our last presentation, who's chaired by Yana.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for staying all the way to the end. My name is Sam Homero, and before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to my friends and family who are not only here in person, but also on the live stream. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I also wanted to say thank you to my thesis committee, to Dean Don Jordan for joining us in the middle of the semester and providing me with such great insight. And thank you to Lindsay for keeping me on track. And thank you to Yana for being my biggest advocate and being an amazing mentor to me over the past 3 years. So without further ado, this is Malama Aina, Sustaining Resilient Relationships Between the Land and the People. And so this is a research question that I've been grappling with throughout the past year, is how can tourism be used as a tool to foster meaningful connections between Kanaka Maoli, which are Native Hawaiians, Kama'aina, local people, and tourists and the landscape in Oahu, Hawaii. A little bit about me before we get started is that I am not Hawaiian. This is not a hometown thesis. I was born in the Philippines and I immigrated to the United States, to Maryland specifically, when I was 3 with my family. And I've lived in Maryland ever since. Part of my interest that has kind of grown throughout my time in architecture school is this intersection between the built environment, the landscape, and culture, specifically how the built environment has this ability to tell the story of a place. And all my life, I kind of never really had a strong connection with place. And this is kind of something that a lot of first-generation immigrants can probably relate to. In America, I'm Filipino, but when I go back to the Philippines, I'm so American. And so that kind of leads into why I decided to situate this thesis in Hawaii. I had a chance to visit Hawaii last year in March, and I got to talk to so many different people, and they kind of had this one thing in common, and that is that they had this really strong sense of place. They cared for and advocated for the land that they lived in, and speaking to them really, and hearing their stories really made me feel responsible to Malama Aina, or to take care of the land the way that they do, even though I was only there for a brief amount of time. And in addition, I also really wanted to unpack the role that American imperialism played and continues to play on the islands. This is a diagram of the architectural design process. As an architecture student, I've gotten very familiar with this process, and so I use this as a means to explore this thesis. And so typically in design studios, we usually only get through the first stages of the design process. And so going into this project, I figured that this would be the scope of this exploration. But what ended up happening was that I went through this process that looked a little bit more like this. This is a process that is reflective of this back and forth dialogue that I had, not only with the work and the materials, but also with my peers and my mentors. This is the process that I want to share with you all today, and how kind of the design process helped me to embody this knowledge and then apply it to a design. The first part of this process was to conduct a lot of historical and site research. So I looked at how humans' relationship with the land has changed over time and how those relationships impact the built environment. The first concept I learned about while researching this period of time was the concept of the ahupua'a. Ahupua'a is a land division system, one that is based on ecological, geological, and climatic factors, where the island gets divided into these little pie slices that stretch from the top of the mountain all the way down to the ocean. As we can see in this diagram, these parcels of land are formed by and follow the flow of water downstream. The ahupua'a was designed to have this continuous access to fresh water to ultimately create this self-sustaining agriculture and aquaculture system. Hawaiians believe that if they had access to wai, or to water, that they would also have waiwai, which is wealth. To the right is this famous diagram that they teach at the Kamehameha school system that shows the different zones and ecotones that the ahupua'a covers. This diagram on the left applies those same zones and ecotones onto the ahupua'a that the site is located on, and that is the Pupukea ahupua'a. We can see that there are several perennial streams within the site, as well as several non-perennial streams. I also began to study Hawaiian vernacular by understanding and dissecting Hawaiian hales. And what I found interesting about the hale is that each one housed a very specific program. And depending on the program, it shows how it was built responds to that program. So over to the left is the hale noa, or a sleeping hale. And you can see that the thatch covers most of the sides. And that is because when you're sleeping, you would want more privacy. Versus the right is the hale ola, or the house of healing, which is a completely different structure. It's a lot more open because this is a house of healing. And so that means it's a lot more open and for the bad energies to be able to flow out. And as a way to visualize these findings, I created a kit of parts to show the different ways the base, the structure, and the enclosure can come together to form a hale. Each part is named after an action, like lay, or sit, or stand, because the Hawaiians saw the hale as this extension of the human form. The kit of parts also reveals the materiality used for the hale, like thatch, wood, cordage, and stone. And one particular material that I want to highlight is it comes from the lolu tree, which is thatch. And for the thatch to be usable for the hale, it must kind of die and remain attached to the tree, because what happens when you harvest the leaves from the lolu tree when it's matured and it's died is that it forms this natural waterproof layer that is entirely biological. And so if you pick the leaves while the tree is still, or while the leaves are still alive on the tree, it won't produce that layer. And so it's kind of this really interesting way that the tree communicates with us that it's okay to take this part because it no longer serves a purpose to itself. And this is the embedded technology that often gets overlooked. And then the next part of this research looks at post-contact Hawaii. That can be summarized through the violence of agro-militarization. This term is coined by Sean Connolly, a professor and artist who uses their architectural knowledge and embodied Hawaiian knowledge to inform their line of practice and their work. And so this word can be broken down into three moving parts: agriculture, military, and tourism. And so these three factors have contributed to this more extractive relationship between the humans and the land. Monocrop culture was this huge thing in the early 20th century. It depleted the soil of its nutrients and was made specifically for economic profit. We tend to associate pineapple, the fruit, with Hawaii because of how big Dole, the company, is. But really, pineapples aren't even native to Hawaii. And so we can see how these plantations are specifically located in the valleys between these two mountain ranges, because that's where the most fertile soil is located. The second moving part is military presence. The map on the right reveals the different military bases located around the coast of Oahu versus the training grounds located on the center of the island. And that kind of begs the question of who and what gets protected and at what cost. Oops. And then the third moving part is tourism. This map on the right reveals the different areas where the concentration of hotels are high, Waikiki being the most dense. And tourism is a very American phenomenon that was caused by these two big events. The first one being the end of World War II in 1945 and Hawaii becoming a state in 1959. And so with access to air travel, specifically domestic travel, more people were able to visit Hawaii at a more affordable cost, especially since the US was experiencing an economic boom at the time. And so why is this all important to know? Hawaii's tourism industry has created tension between visitors and locals. The islands were historically marketed as a consumable paradise, leading to tourists treating them as a playground. However, there's this growing movement towards restoration and sustainability, and that includes initiatives like reviving traditional farming practices and rebuilding ancient fish ponds like Loko'ia. And so this thesis kind of looks at how architecture can encourage ethical land stewardship through aina-based education as a response to this research. How can tourists learn about the land and culture of the place that they are visiting in a way that supports them more than just economically? By teaching them to care for the land that they visit too. And so the goals and objectives of this thesis are also in line with the Aloha Challenge, which is kind of Hawaii's version of the SDGs, of encouraging aina-based education and community engagement. And so these 4 objectives are to promote an aina-based education through experiential learning, explore passive sustainable strategies and showcase Hawaiian materials through construction, perpetuate Hawaiian cultures, traditions, and histories through oral and visual storytelling, and to design with Aloha Aina. And so what is it exactly that I'm designing? It's this small-scale agricultural didactic landscape that is composed of a formal learning center, pavilions and learning landscapes, and overnight cabins. And this is inspired by and is meant to be meant to resemble kind of a microcosm of the idea of the ahupua'a. But for the scope of this thesis, I will be focusing on the further development of, and design of the learning pavilions that is situated within the productive landscape. And so in selecting a site, the goal was to find a place that would attract both tourists and locals. And so having the site be in the North Shore was strategic because it's still very popular amongst tourists to visit because they have a lot of like nature-based activities like snorkeling and surfing, but it also has a history of having this strong, a lot of strong community members. At one point, there were plans for high-rise development in Haleiwa, which is one of the towns in North Shore, and the community has kind of brought it to a halt every single time. And so in a way, by having the site be on the opposite side of Waikiki, where there's the most tourists, they're kind of traversing through all the destruction before arriving to the site. And the island of Oahu is pretty drivable. It would take about roughly 50 minutes to get from the airport all the way to the site and is accessible to everyone else on the island. And so zooming into the site itself, this diagram reveals different adjacencies located very close by. There are several green spaces and parks, as well as an elementary school and country market that share kind of the same entrance from Kamehameha Highway, which is the only road that you can take to access the site. The site is about 20 acres, and yeah, Kamehameha Highway kind of runs along the coast of Oahu, and so it gets kind of backed up sometimes, most of the times. And so here is the proposed design for the site. When you first get to the site, you park at the forest parking lot before going to the learning center. And then from there, you walk through botanical gardens, before arriving at the storytelling pavilion, which kind of introduces you to the other pavilions and the more productive landscape. And then down here are the overnight cabins. And so we can see how this intervention fits into the ahapua'a as it serves as the wao kanaka, or the activity zone. You can see how it's kind of sandwiched between the coastal zone, or the kahakai, and the mauka, or the mountains. And so now looking into the pavilion design, this is the storytelling pavilion. It is inspired by the hale wa'a, which are where the canoes used to be stored when they're not being used. And so this pavilion kind of pays homage to the first Polynesian voyagers who arrived by boat and the early beginnings of Hawaii. And here's a little approach perspective to the storytelling pavilion. And then the next pavilion is the piko, or the navel. And the circle is a form that is celebrated and considered holy or cosmologically significant in many cultures. And in this case, the piko is kind of inspired by the Hawaiian star compass, which you can see in the diagram on the right. And so not only is the piko this center of the site to help orient visitors, but it also serves as a gathering place that can double as a stage or as a performance venue. And so here's a perspective of the piko. The third pavilion is the outdoor kitchen. The center pavilion is where the kitchen is, so that's where all the cooking and the harvesting and the preparing gets done. And then branching out from either side are the eating areas. And so this pavilion is a direct reference to the halawai and the hale kuai in terms of like the program, but also the structure as well. And so here's a perspective showing the outdoor kitchen. And then surrounding the outdoor kitchen is all the produce that can be harvested by the visitors with the help of the land stewards. And then last but not least, this is the weaving and kapa cloth making pavilion. Although this was inspired by a Hawaiian hale, it is not a direct reflection of one. It introduces this large overhang that resembles a lanai, or a roofed outdoor space. And the ceiling is much lower in these spaces because they're meant to be a place where weavers can prepare the leaves for weaving. And so this diagram on the left shows the pandan tree, the leaves of which are typically used for this craft, for weaving. And then the diagram on the right reveals the step-by-step on how the lauhala gets prepared. And what's fascinating to me about this craft is that even though the preparation is relatively similar, each weaving technique would differ from one family to another. And so here's kind of a perspective looking towards the weaving pavilion. And these 4 pavilions tell different stories about the aspects of Hawaiian culture that act as these manifestations of the embodied knowledge I obtained through conducting this research, as well as learning through making. Throughout this design process, I received so much input from so many different people, from so many different backgrounds, people who are total outsiders to Hawaii, to people who grew up in Hawaii, to people whose work revolves and centers around Hawaii. And so this project is the result of this dialogue that I had with all these different mentors. One interaction I particularly wanted to highlight was this interview with Sean Connolly. And while talking to him about my thesis and my background, he asked me this, and this made me really reflect on the kind of work that I'm doing. And he asked, how do your values align with the work that you're producing? And that kind of led me to reflect on my positionality and the role that positionality plays on design. And so what is my positionality as it relates to this design? I am a product of American imperialism because I'm part of this Asian American and Pacific Islander diaspora, which maybe is why I'm drawn to this work. I'm also a student who was taught in a very Western system and Western way of knowing. But I'm also an outsider to Hawaii and have been a tourist visiting those lands. I am all of those things at once and at the same time. And so when Sean asked me this question, he followed up by asking why I decided to make the target demographic tourists when there are community-based efforts that are already doing this work. And to that, I told him that I don't think I'm in a position where the resources or people that I have access to allows me to be, or invites me to be a part of those community spaces yet. And that's why I kind of took the opposite approach to catering towards tourists, because I am one, and that is the relationship that I have with that space. And in realizing that stance, I recognize that the product of this design process is a place that is curated through a settler colonial lens. It's designed for the enjoyment of tourists and culturally appropriates Hawaiian vernacular and traditions. And here are some examples of how. The paths. They only highlight the circulation paths that the tourists go on. It doesn't reveal the various circulation paths and the hosts that the hosts and the land stewards should be that they take to maintain and upkeep the well-being of the land. These are the paths that would have been taken by those tending to the land, and that could mean the people who work there, but it also could mean the next generation of land stewards, like the children from elementary schools who can take field trips there and learn how to care for the things that are growing on there. And these paths can coexist and be great opportunities to learn from each other within the same space. I also deliberately chose to include introduced tree species around the site with a higher concentration in the forest parking lot and the botanical gardens to show that it can be this inconspicuous thing that blends in with the rest of the native plantings. In comparison, this diagram looks at the native trees on the site, which is a lot more prominent. And so it's important also that the site uses or introduces a polycultural farming as a way to respond to the destruction that the monocrops previously had on the lands. This diagram shows the different vegetation layers, the non-native and the native vegetation kind of working to create this holistic experience. And it just showcases how big of a role the landscape plays in shaping the visitors' experiences. And so here we see the different ways I kind of translated and regurgitated what I learned from the Hawaiian hale into the pavilion design. These hale, the storytelling and the outdoor kitchen hales kind of imitate either the program, the structure, or both. Whereas these pavilions are used the hale as kind of this jumping off point to create something non-traditional. And so this design allows for flexibility in how the space gets used and who gets to use and occupy it, as a way to rethink how tourists can learn from the landscape and design. This design kind of looks into creating community spaces that can be designated co-build areas using the materials grown on the site. And so local organizations or like class field trips, they can come onto the site and use the materials grown to create like this almost like living museum so that the tourists can kind of learn from what can be currently made with these materials. And so this process made me reflect not only about my positionality in relation to this process, but also made me hyper aware of the positionality in that it plays in, that positionality plays in the educational setting. Who are we learning from and with, and how does that affect what gets said versus what gets left unsaid about certain topics? The second being architecture is a profession that is moving away from this top-down approach to a more community-based work. But we also need to be aware of how to be inclusive of these voices without feeling entitled to that input and feedback. Indigenous knowledge, community embodied knowledge, is not open source, and we shouldn't feel entitled to that information. And sometimes it's best to kind of take a step back. Last but not least, design is complex and nuanced, and this project only reveals one play-by-play on the way this project turned out. But there are so many forms of this project that could have embodied depending on the process. And so I wanted to hand out these zines to everyone. Yes. And so if you look at the scene, it kind of walks you through my personal process with Thesis. And if you open it all the way up, you'll see a diagram showing just how chaotic, layered, and nuanced this process really was, because these boards are kind of just like this distilled version of the design process, and you can see just how nonlinear it actually was. But with that being said, I'd like to open it up for discussion. I can give it to
Thanks. It was fun to see how much progress you've made in such a short time. So I want to go back to tourism for a little bit. When we think about tourism in Hawaii, we think about people coming from other places to Hawaii, and I'm not sure demographically, how many people that is. But there's the other kind of tourism too. There's the local tourism. And you started talking about the local schools coming to use this place. And I wondered if you could talk to us more about the user experience of the site, because you've located these cabins for people to come and stay. And so I'm wondering, who do you think will come stay? And what will they do when they're there? I mean, certainly there's the ability to tour this property, but there are ecotourism experiences that you go and you work really hard at. Is this one of those places?
I think it depends on the type of traveler you are. I can imagine if you're a local tourist and you're, this could be a great place for outdoor education. In middle school, I also went to an outdoor education program where I stayed over at cabins overnight, and we kind of did a bunch of different things in the landscape, and that was really fun. So I can imagine this being like this overnight or like weekend trip for students around the island that they can come to and kind of break out into these different groups where they can either walk around the botanical gardens and learn more about the flowers, or the storytelling pavilion, which is this model right here. It has this space where you can kind of stand on the stone, if you want to see that. Where you can kind of stand on the stone, it becomes this like informal place of gather and learning to learn more about, with the landscape kind of in the background. And other activities can be like kalo cultivating, or learning about the different plants and vegetables and fruits that can be grown on the site as well. Or even making kappa cloths, which is this art of like taking wood bark and pounding them to create cloth. And in the weaving pavilion, you can learn how to prepare and then weave using the materials located on site before kind of coming back to the Pico if there's like a performance, or just like it's like a good gathering place where people can kind of either watch performances or I don't know. And then the cabins are kind of where they would stay overnight. This is the admin cabin. And then there are also these layer of group cabins and then individual cabins. So depending on who you're going with, if it's a group or if it's individual, it would kind of show which cabin you'd have. Oh yes, that is this. Okay, so this thesis process actually started. Yeah, it's right there. It started way before this year. I did an independent study last year looking at traditional ecological knowledge, and this was kind of one of the pavilions, one of the models that I created because of it. And this was empty at first, but over maybe like a month ago or so, there was this bird that came into the building and made a nest in the pavilion, and so it kind of shows just how, like, I guess it resembles a birdhouse, and it felt comfortable enough to nest in there. Yeah, the green stuff was not mine. It took, I don't know, moss and brought it into the building.
we'll talk about adapting to architecture. Yeah, you have a lot of ideas here, and it's just going to take me a second to. Yeah, I saw it already. Thank you to So I have a few questions or thoughts, and it's so that I can understand the project. So the red in the site plan. I'll start with some. That's the boardwalk.
Yes.
And why is it red? And is it a design choice, or are you trying to? Is the soil? I've never been to Hawaii, so I don't know. Is the soil red, or it's a very sort of, deliberate move on your part, and I want to understand that.
Yeah, I've been kind of representing non-native like species and paths with red, and then with green, I've been revealing more local paths and species, and so that's kind of why I decided to use red.
Okay, so the tourists and the settlers, if you will, are on the red paths.
Yes.
As a sort of a way to organize it. So, yeah, I guess I would say for this site plan that, a lot of times there is the public paths, and then there's the private, which is the service. And so I don't really see any service lines on here, but maybe within this type of experience, you want to have people to be more grounded. And so they also see the service. Like, in other words, then, like, as a tourist, I'm going to the cottage, and, like, I have to trek from the parking lot all across 20 acres. That's quite a bit of a hike. So I don't know if there's a shortcut or a layering of.
This kind of shows the service paths. It's kind of buried. It's in green. But these are kind of the paths that like the people who like work there would take to help maintain and upkeep.
Okay, great. So
the land.
So it would have been interesting to see that part, as part of this to sort of better understand what was happening. The same thing with the site plan. Like there were some. You talked about some specific trees that were incredibly important. I kind of lost them in this plan, so just to mention that to you. And then, like a lot of the buildings, I'm having a hard time just understanding the scale. Like the outdoor kitchen building, for example. I get the construction. I get now, where the references are for. But like, how big is that? If there were maybe a person in there, I might be able to understand. I'd like to see myself or a person in these spaces, particularly because you talk so much about a return to showing the traditions and having a different idea, reframing what tourism looks like, then having a respect for the people and the craft that goes into all of these things these functions. And I'm not really seeing a person inside some of these spaces, so it's just a little hard for me right now.
Yeah, the dimensions are kind of buried into the site plan, but they're about like 20 by 40 ish. The storytelling pavilion is a little bit bigger than that. It's about like 60-ish feet because it's like this tunnel that you kind of walk through.
Yeah, maybe if I'm having some of the circulation for how the features that are furthest away from the parking lot, I'm having a tough time in my mind understanding how those visitors would be able to get to those functions without walking a lot.
Oh yeah, it's yeah.
So, but that may or may not be part of the deliberate experience that you want to have for visitors. I can pass on to anyone.
Maybe just to continue talking about the paths for a moment. Do I understand right that the blue is the steward's path?
No, the blue is a stream.
Oh, it's the stream.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was concocting a fantasy here, but you, to some extent, you have planned the buildings and some of the paths along the contours, which is very appropriate because that is the way that you want to orient your buildings, and I think you want people walking along the contours. Water flows across the contours, and so then the flow of people can be with the contours. And so while I think that the idea of having the paths be decking might be good for accessibility, I think that, you know, your concern for the, I'm going to mispronounce it, Ahuapa, where we really see the water moving, you know, across the contours. I think that kind of concern for movement across the landscape, you know, might just lead you to different path configurations. While that kind of flower-like path system is kind of fabulous, you know, I think that you're much more really about being in the land. So I would just think about that. And then just one other thing. I so appreciated your talking to Justin Monongdo.
Yes.
He was my thesis student a number of years back. And so it's awfully nice to see the wisdom of Thesis continuing, getting passed on to future generations.
Yes. He's been sitting in on a lot of our thesis meetings, and so he's been providing me with such great insight. So
fantastic.
Thank you, Justin, if you're seeing this.
I'm just gonna stay away a little bit from this and kind of like use a second to recognize the effort that you've done post-project, because this whole part of your presentation where you're critiquing yourself and you're not critiquing, that sounds harsh, but like having a position of what you've done and why you've done it, I think it's something that we should all applaud, because it's very easy not to do it and stop at the projects like, hey, this is my final delivery, I'm done, now you go and critique it. So I just want to take a minute to like,
thank you.
Thumbs up. And I love your graphics. I think they're beautiful. I do like this intention, like constant intention that you have with showing, you know, the cellular versus the local, that constant duality that you're fighting, because I think you're fighting it in many ways. And at some point you're like, well, it is what it is, so I'm just gonna express it. I'm not gonna try to hide it anymore, or like blend it anymore. I'm just gonna embrace it. And I think that for me, like your images are very compelling. I think the architecture or the project meet per se could evolve a little bit further.
Yes.
But you know, this is what Thesis is about. You set up this, and then you go and make this a real project some other day. So that's great. Thank you.
Congratulations for your thesis. It's interesting to me that in this case, the relationship is not just between architecture and landscaping, it's also between a wild area and the anthropomorphic area. And so in this sense, you respect perfectly the context. And the context could be the key to read your presentation, because you start with the historical context, you know, the tradition that we can see everywhere, from the technology, from your beautiful models. And thank you for the organization of the presentation. What I like very much also is this strong relationship between the locals, the farmers, and the tourism. Because very often in the tourist city in general, there is a path, area, Dick Street that unfortunately becomes always more tourist and less local. A local left the, you know, the more traditional area. In this case, there is this, you know, tentative to live in the same space. And so it means instead of spread up, you focus on in the area. So this is I appreciate a lot. Thank you.
I think, well, one of the things I've just been thinking about is I feel like this thesis has taken you into a very sort of existential world of wondering what it means to be a designer and what it means especially to have a personal identity, and then also to be navigating, designing for a place that you do not personally have, you know, like like it's not your hometown or it's not. And I think that, I mean, these are always like tricky things to navigate, especially in a school environment, because actually I feel like when you're in school, you don't have a client that you're actively speaking with. So a lot of times it can feel very intimidating to be like, I'm going to propose a design concept that I think people that live in this place that I don't actually know that well will appreciate and enjoy. And I think while that's a scary thing, I think maybe it was holding you back a little bit at times. And I think that as a designer, you know, you don't necessarily have to shy away from considering how, you know, locals might be using this. I don't think you have to necessarily take the view that, oh, because I would experience this as a tourist, I will design it for tourists. And that's, you know, I mean, I think that's just a kind of broader like I think it's okay to grapple with some of these difficult you know, situations between who is the designer, who are you designing for, and how can you imagine what their feedback would be, even if you're not getting that actual feedback in a studio environment. And I think because of that, I would kind of question moving forward, or like if you were to do another pass at this, how you can use some of the languages of this existing architecture and sort of insert things that make it new in a sense, right? Because you are coming from your own unique context, and I think there's a lot of value in modifying what already exists for a more contemporary environment, and recognizing too that like our world is continually becoming more and more global, right? That we're having more and more people, not just tourists come to Hawaii, but people move to Hawaii that are not necessarily Hawaiian, that are existing, you know, in different sorts of realms of identity, whether, you know, whether they once had historic Hawaiian roots and then come back, or immigrate from across the world. So I think just like I feel like you've had a very sort of hesitant hand in the architecture, because you've been maybe like scared of creating possible offenses and things. And I think that there's also, you know, I think you can play more of a hand and have it a little bit more like loose and playful, and understand that like design is always a creative process. It can be very well resolved without being top down, while still allowing for places where you would be getting input from the local community or something like that. Basically, I think you could have a lot of fun with it, and I feel like maybe you were holding yourself back in some points because of
definitely.
how big of a topic all of this is.
There was definitely a lot of like, I don't think I delved into the design process. I mean, like the designing of the pavilions as much as I really wanted to, because of the fact that I was kind of like grappling of whether or not I should do this, or maybe it shouldn't even be in Hawaii. Maybe it should. I don't know. And it was like all these different dialogues kind of strayed me into different places that I, like the design almost felt like secondary to the learning that happened, like in the research that happened before it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's good, and I think it's good to have such a self-awareness. I think it's like a really productive exercise. I think don't be afraid to have fun with it too, and to like let yourself have a hand in the aesthetic of things, and like recognize that you have something to contribute to the site rather than just pulling from what's already existing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
I kind of want to add on to that a little bit. I mean, I think it appears, and I mean, I love these little models. I mean, it appears that you kind of, it's almost like you went and took, you know, in a way, you're like putting your mind in the sense of taking like some craftsman or person that builds buildings in Hawaii was like teaching you how to build them, and then you just replicated them. And so I think that the idea that you could have taken those things and abstracted them and made them more yours, you know, in a way. But I do want to address this, like the kind of hesitancy, and like I really appreciate how you started with like the design process and what your design process really was, and then what like school is and how that's different from practice. And at the very end, you came back and talked about positionality, which is a term I've actually, as many podcasts as I've listened to, I've never heard that term. I've heard of intersectionality, never heard of positionality. I think that's the key. I think the idea that you know where you're from, or that you know what you don't know, is important, because people will hire architects and designers to come into places that they weren't before. And I think it's, as long as you know what you don't know, you can be of value to them. And I think I've been in situations like that, designing or working with, you know, people totally outside of my normal day-to-day operations. And I've heard sometimes this idea that like you can be a mirror to them, or you can amplify things that they've forgotten. They've forgotten the beauty of the thing that they have, and you're looking at it fresh. So there's something about that I think is super powerful. And I think you should wield that, but always keep that recognition of like where you came from, how you've learned, what you haven't learned, and that you're always a sponge too, and that you're malleable to that, and you don't get stuck in you know, what one way of doing things. So I want to read something to you too, because this I went to a conference a number of years ago. It's probably way longer than I want to admit now. In Nova Scotia, a bunch of great architects together, all talking about regionalism and the idea of, you know, the local architect versus the global architect. And there was a kind of stodgy old Australian architect who's I think he was like a protege of Glenn Murcutt. His name is Peter Stutchbury, and he's beautiful projects. And he started his presentation talking about a technique of learning, like a process. And I have this graphic that I'm always like badgering my employees with, you know, check this out, read this, you know. And so I'm going to read it, and I want you to think, there'll be one line that I think you'll appreciate the most, which is, so this is the technique, and it's 11 steps, and then it recycles. So relax, adjust, listen to what's around, try to piece it together, don't rush, think about courage, smell, now look carefully, find the reason, weave it together, trust your intuition. So the thing I'm always talking about is this think about courage part. You know, it's like every day, everything you do, you know, whether you're working with a client or a project, no client, and you're trying to like test yourself and push yourself, am I doing the right thing? Am I making the right choices? And you're not always going to be right. You're not going to be perfect. But if that's the beacon, I think that's success. So super appreciative of this beautiful work. But I think the kind of underpinning of what you tried to do and where you pushed yourself is super important for all of us.
Thank you.
I feel like I'm witness to courage here. I think you starting a presentation where you have to say, this is who I am, because you can't present this project without saying, this is who I am. Right now, this is who I know who I am. And then at the back end of the presentation, to even recognize that it's important to reflect on the entire process, to understand your place in it, the positionality. I don't think that occurs to everyone. So I want to applaud you for recognizing that. I want to applaud you for staying in the tension of it, even though it must have been difficult, and it sounds like you were questioning it probably every day. Am I doing the right thing? Is this too much, too little? Do I just throw my hands up in the air? But to stay with the trouble, I think, was incredibly productive. So I want to applaud you for that. But then I also wanted to talk about the design itself. And I wanted to ask you about this drawing here. Is this a cross-section of that?
Yes. So
It is.
it is a cross section of not only the site but also down to the water and up the mountains. Probably like
Mhm.
yeah.
I think one of the things I'm struggling with the site plan is I don't quite understand its relationship to the larger Apuhua,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And the
Yes.
Apuhua, as you described, is actually a watershed, right? Ranging from the tip of a mountain ridge down to the coast, right? And what's incredible about the way that the Native Hawaiians occupied the land is they were using every part of that watershed, right? They were occupying a salinity gradient in the water. They were occupying a whole range of ecotones, right? And in each location, as they worked their way up in altitude, they had a different expression for the architecture and for the way of occupying the land, right? And so the sense that I get from this drawing, because I can't quite understand the scale, is that you've occupied a single ecotone. It
Yes.
feels like to
Yes.
me.
Yes.
And I wonder if we were to take that winding path and unravel it and start to move it up the Apua so that you're taking us from the coast all the way up, halfway up the mountain and giving us episodes along the way. I wonder if that would be a way to really reveal the richness of the topographic conditions, the richness of the way that the Native Hawaiians occupied this land in different ways. As opposed to this kind of, this series of episodes that kind of wind around each other and create, they condense there. So that's why I was kind of looking at this section here and just kind of squinting my eyes at it and just imagining it wasn't, that it really kind of does stretch out across the entire thing. So maybe if you could respond to that.
So the site actually has a pillbox hike that is really popular in Hawaii that people park over here in the parking lot and then it starts around here. And so maybe, and then it goes like all the way up the mountain where there's like a big overlook where the pillbox is. And maybe finding ways to connect like the cabins down to the hike could be a way to extend the paths up to the mountains. But yeah, that's a really good point.
Sam, this is a beautiful project and really sensitively handled with the research you did and the way you framed it with your perspective. And I was really struck by what you said about actually protecting the craft knowledge of the local builders and bringing that into the equation. Because when we use local construction techniques, it's a form of transfer. It's a form of transfer of power. And it reminds me of Edward Said's post-colonial theory. It also reminds me of what has happened in the Western architectural tradition. When Diderot wrote his encyclopedia, he sent people out to learn the construction techniques of all the craftsmen. The craftsmen were very reticent about sharing them, but they did, and then they were deeply disenfranchised when the encyclopedia was published, and students could now master these techniques in the École des Beaux-Arts. So I just think that's really interesting and provocative. I wonder if the next step in this project is to develop a system where that intangible heritage is preserved by employing local builders and not asking them to disclose their secrets and supporting their industry all at once.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Working? Yes. It was so good to have this conversation. So thank you for hosting it. What Sam isn't, I really appreciate also the comments about like almost giving you permission to play and be brave. Courage, brave, those were words that were used. And I do think you were really brave. What this group doesn't know and it's connected to the hesitancy, is that about 2 months ago, a committee member dropped off the thesis because of the difficulty of the topic. We were right in the middle of talking about settler colonialism and cultural appropriation through storytelling. And it was really hard, right? So like a month and a half ago, I remember you were sitting in my office saying, do I dig deeper into the tectonics? Do I design this storytelling pavilion? And we know she can design. You're an amazing architect, right? Or do I take the rest of the semester and reflect on, you know, the critiques and what it means for me to be doing a thesis like this even? And you sat with that for a while, and then you made a choice to do the reflection. And I think that was brave, because standing up here, you know, for a Master of Architecture thesis, maybe without a fully fleshed out, you know, section perspective and wall section, I do think that's brave, right? Because you will hear the critique. You need to, you know, you should go further, and it's true. And now I think you have hopefully some permission, and you know that there's a way you can do that without without stepping on toes or creating contentiousness that is bad. It's good trouble. So just, I want to thank you for being so brave. It's been a real honor to watch you go through that process.
Thank you.
Congratulations, and congratulations to all of our thesis students. Can we please have a round of applause for all of our presenters for the last 3 days? You can relax. Okay, and we're just going to take a few minutes together while we're still here and relishing, I think, in all the conversations. If the jurors could kind of come forward and turn around. And if anybody that's not like kind of in the room wants to come in the room, we have lots of chairs. Brian and I will broker a little
chat.
breakdown. Yeah.
Hey, and before we're all out the door, I want to thank the folks back in TSC.
Down, TSC. Get out here. Get out here.
Without them, the folks at home would not have seen any of this. And want to thank Paula and the entire office staff for making sure that we were well fed and well taken care of the past couple of days.
So we like to take this time at the end of thesis just to reflect on the process, on the